The medieval world loved a spectacle, but its darkest secrets were kept under lock and key. Tonight, we unlock the door to the hidden world of medieval punishments, the ones too clever, too cruel for the public eye. These weren't just punishments, they were masterpieces of pain, designed in the shadows, and they've been whispered about ever since. Before we begin our descent into these forgotten chambers of suffering, take a moment to settle in. Maybe adjust your pillows, dim those lights a little more. And if you're new here, consider subscribing if you find yourself drawn to these darker corners of history. Tonight's journey takes us behind the stone walls of castles, into the depths of dungeons that most people never knew existed, and into the minds of those who believed that true justice required absolute secrecy. Because sometimes the most effective punishment wasn't the one that made you scream for all to hear. Sometimes it was the one that made you disappear entirely, leaving only questions and carefully crafted lies in your wake. So settle back, let the familiar sounds of your evening routine fade into the background, and let's explore together the medieval punishments that were so brutal, so psychologically devastating, that they remained hidden for centuries. Some of these methods were so effective at breaking the human spirit that their very existence was considered a state secret. Others were so horrifying that even the executioners themselves were sworn to silence. The medieval world, as we'll discover tonight, had a talent for cruelty that went far beyond what they displayed in their public squares. And perhaps most unsettling of all, some of these techniques were so sophisticated, so carefully designed to destroy a person from the inside out, that they reveal a level of psychological understanding that we might not expect from an era we often dismiss as primitive. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start our exploration where many of these secret punishments began, in a place that was designed to make people vanish without a trace, where the very architecture itself became an instrument of slow, methodical torture. The oubliette, where people simply ceased to exist. If medieval architects had a specialty in designing despair, the oubliette would be their masterpiece. The name itself comes from the French word oublier, meaning to forget, and that tells you everything you need to know about its purpose. This wasn't a prison where you served your time and eventually walked free. This was a place where you were deposited like a piece of unwanted furniture left to be forgotten by the world above. Picture this. You're standing in what appears to be an ordinary castle floor, perhaps in the Great Hall or a storage room. The stones beneath your feet look solid, unremarkable, but hidden beneath the carefully concealed trapdoor lies a shaft that drops straight down into the earth, sometimes 20 feet, sometimes more. The opening at the top is just wide enough for a human body to fall through, but far too narrow for that same body to climb back out. The beauty of the oubliette, from a captor's perspective, was its simplicity. No guards were needed. No elaborate mechanisms required maintenance. No public feeding schedules to maintain the pretense of humane treatment. You were simply lowered down, or more often, dropped down, and that was that. The trap door closed above you with a sound like a coffin lid, and you found yourself in a space barely large enough to stand upright if you were lucky. The walls were typically carved from solid rock or built with stones so tightly fitted that not even a fingernail could find purchase between them. The floor, if you could call it that, was often nothing more than the natural bedrock, sometimes deliberately left uneven to prevent comfortable rest. There were no windows, of course, no source of light except for the thin crack around the trapdoor far above your head, which provided just enough illumination to let you see the hopelessness of your situation. But the true genius of the oubliette wasn't in its construction. It was in its psychological impact. Unlike other forms of medieval punishment, which relied on pain or public humiliation, the oubliette worked by removing you from existence itself. Above ground, life continued exactly as it had before. Your family might search for you, but there would be no trace. Your friends might ask questions, but there would be no answers. You had simply vanished, as if you had never existed at all. The isolation was absolute. Days would pass without human contact, without conversation, without even the sound of footsteps overhead to remind you that there was still a world of living people somewhere above. The silence was so complete that many prisoners reported hearing their own heartbeat echoing off the stone walls, a constant reminder that they were still alive in a place designed to make them wish they weren't. Food, when it came at all, was lowered down on a rope, usually just enough to keep you alive, but never enough to satisfy hunger. Water dripped down the walls or was provided in small quantities, again just sufficient to prevent death, but never enough to provide comfort. The message was clear. You were being kept alive not out of mercy, but to prolong your suffering. The most psychologically devastating aspect of the oubliette was the uncertainty. Unlike other punishments which had defined durations, you had no idea how long you would remain in this stone tomb. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and still the trapdoor above remained closed. Some prisoners were forgotten entirely, their captors dying or losing interest, leaving them to slowly starve in their underground graves. At Warwick Castle, the oubliette in Caesar's Tower still exists today, a cramped stone cell that drops down from the floor above like a medieval nightmare made real. Visitors can peer down into it and try to imagine spending even a single night in that space, let alone the months or years that some prisoners endured. The walls still bear scratches made by fingernails, desperate attempts to mark the passage of time or simply to feel something other than smooth, indifferent stone. Perhaps the most chilling example of the oubliette's use comes from Corfe Castle, where 22 French knights were lowered into the depths and simply left there. Not executed, not ransomed, not even acknowledged. They were forgotten, deliberately and completely, until they starved to death in the darkness. Their crime? Being on the losing side of a political dispute that their captors preferred to handle quietly. The oubliette represented something uniquely medieval in its approach to punishment. The idea that some crimes, some people, were so inconvenient that the best solution was to make them disappear entirely. No messy executions to explain, no public trials to justify, no bodies to dispose of. Just a trap door that closed, and a problem that solved itself through the simple passage of time. What made this punishment particularly insidious was how it turned the prisoner's own mind against them. In the complete darkness and silence, hallucinations were common. Some prisoners reported conversations with people who weren't there, or seeing lights that didn't exist. Others became convinced that they had died and were experiencing some form of afterlife. The line between reality and madness blurred until many prisoners could no longer tell the difference. The oubliette also served as the perfect deterrent for those who knew of its existence. The threat of simply vanishing, of being erased from the world without explanation or ceremony, was often more effective than the promise of a quick death. At least execution offered a kind of finality, a resolution. The oubliette offered only questions that would never be answered. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the oubliette was often used not for the worst criminals, but for the most inconvenient ones. Political prisoners who knew too much, witnesses to crimes committed by the powerful, or simply people who had asked the wrong questions at the wrong time. These weren't necessarily murderers or traitors in the traditional sense. They were simply people who had become problems that needed to disappear quietly. The psychological sophistication of this punishment is remarkable when you consider the era. Medieval society understood, perhaps better than we give them credit for, that the human mind could be broken more thoroughly than the human body. Physical torture might extract a confession, but the oubliette could erase a person's very sense of self, leaving them questioning not just their circumstances, but their own existence. Today, when we think of medieval justice, we often picture the dramatic public executions, the stocks in the town square, the elaborate torture devices displayed for all to see. But the oubliette reminds us that some of the most effective punishments were the ones that nobody saw at all, the ones that worked in silence, in darkness, in the spaces between what was acknowledged and what was simply allowed to fade away. The trapdoor would close, the stone floor would be swept clean, and life would continue as if nothing had happened. Except somewhere below, in a space too small for hope and too dark for dreams, someone was learning that there were fates worse than death. They were learning what it meant to be forgotten while still alive, to exist in a world that had decided they no longer mattered. And the most chilling part, sometimes, after months or years, the trapdoor would finally open again. But by then, what emerged was no longer quite human. The oubliette had done its work, creating not just a punishment, but a warning to anyone who might consider crossing those who held the keys to these hidden chambers of despair. The alchemist's arsenal, when poison became an art form. While the oubliette relied on isolation and despair, medieval authorities had another weapon in their secret arsenal that was far more subtle, far more deniable, and in many ways far more terrifying. This was the realm of the poison master, where chemistry met cruelty and where death could be disguised as illness, madness, or simple misfortune. The medieval understanding of poisons was surprisingly sophisticated, blending early medical knowledge with alchemical experimentation and a deep understanding of human psychology. These weren't the crude, obvious toxins of popular imagination. These were carefully crafted substances designed to achieve specific effects, to weaken without killing, to confuse without obviously poisoning, to create suffering that could be explained away as natural causes. Imagine being summoned to what appears to be a routine interrogation. The chamber looks ordinary enough, perhaps even comfortable compared to the dungeons you might have expected. There's a table, some chairs, maybe even wine and food offered as a gesture of hospitality. Your captors seem reasonable, almost friendly. They ask their questions politely, and when you don't provide the answers they want, they simply wait. They're patient. They have time. What you don't realize is that the wine you've been offered contains a carefully measured dose of a substance derived from ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. Not enough to kill you, but enough to create a creeping sense of unease, a feeling that the walls are moving slightly, that shadows are shifting in your peripheral vision. Your captors continue their questions, and now you're not quite sure if you're answering them correctly. Your thoughts feel sluggish, disconnected. Reality seems to be slipping away at the edges. This was the genius of medieval poison torture. It didn't just attack the body, it attacked the mind's ability to distinguish between what was real and what was induced. A prisoner under the influence of carefully administered hallucinogens might confess to crimes they never committed, simply because they could no longer trust their own memories. They might reveal secrets they had sworn to protect, because the line between thought and speech had become blurred beyond recognition. The poison masters of medieval Europe were often learned men, scholars who had studied the works of ancient physicians and alchemists. They understood that different substances affected different parts of the body and mind. Belladonna could cause delirium and hallucinations. Hemlock could create paralysis while leaving the mind clear, forcing the victim to experience their body's betrayal with full awareness. Arsenic, administered in small doses over time, could create symptoms that perfectly mimicked wasting diseases. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of poison torture was its deniability. A prisoner who died under conventional torture left obvious evidence of their treatment. Broken bones, wounds, burns all told a story that was difficult to explain away. But a prisoner who succumbed to poison could be said to have died of fever, of madness, of a weak constitution. The poison master's art lay not just in creating the desired effect, but in creating effects that could be attributed to natural causes. The preparation of these substances was itself a form of dark artistry. In hidden chambers beneath castles, in rooms that officially didn't exist, alchemists would work with their mortars and pestles, their distillation apparatus, their carefully maintained collections of toxic plants and minerals. They would test their concoctions on animals first, then on prisoners who were already condemned, refining their formulas until they achieved exactly the effect they desired. Some poisons were designed to work immediately, creating instant compliance through overwhelming physical distress. Others were meant to work slowly, over days or weeks, gradually breaking down the victim's resistance as their health mysteriously declined. Still others were psychological weapons, creating paranoia, confusion, or hallucinations that made the victim question their own sanity. The mercury treatments were particularly cruel in their sophistication. Mercury, known to medieval alchemists as quicksilver, could be administered in various forms to create different effects. In small doses, it caused tremors, memory loss, and personality changes. The victim would gradually become a different person, their loved ones watching helplessly as someone they knew transformed into a stranger. Larger doses could cause violent madness, convulsions, and eventually death, but by then the connection to poison was often impossible to prove. Lead-based compounds offered another avenue for the poison master's craft. Lead could be mixed into food or drink in quantities so small as to be tasteless. Yet over time, it would accumulate in the body, causing abdominal pain, weakness, and eventually paralysis. The victim would waste away slowly, their strength ebbing day by day, while their captors expressed sympathy for their mysterious illness. The psychological impact of poison torture extended beyond the immediate victim. Word would spread, carefully and quietly, that certain people had fallen ill after asking inconvenient questions or opposing powerful interests. The message was clear, without ever being stated directly. Cross us, and you might find yourself suffering from a very unfortunate and completely natural illness. What made these methods particularly effective was their unpredictability. Unlike conventional torture, which followed established patterns and procedures, poison torture could be tailored to the individual victim and the specific information being sought. A scholar might be given substances that affected memory and concentration, making it impossible for them to maintain their intellectual defenses. A warrior might be administered compounds that caused weakness and trembling, undermining their sense of physical strength and capability. The timing of poison administration was also crucial to its effectiveness. A substance given just before an important interrogation could ensure that the victim was in a vulnerable state when questioned. Poisons administered over longer periods could gradually wear down resistance, making each subsequent interrogation more effective than the last. Some of the most sophisticated poison tortures involved combinations of substances, creating complex effects that were nearly impossible to counteract. A victim might be given one compound that caused nausea and weakness, followed by another that created hallucinations, and then a third that affected memory. The cumulative effect was a complete breakdown of the person's ability to maintain their mental defenses. The antidotes, when they existed at all, were often as closely guarded as the poisons themselves. A poison master might keep a victim hovering on the edge of death for weeks, administering just enough antidote to prevent fatal poisoning while maintaining the desired level of suffering. This gave them tremendous leverage in interrogations, as they could offer relief from the victim's agony in exchange for cooperation. The record keeping for these activities was deliberately minimal and often coded. A poison master might refer to his substances by alchemical symbols or invented names, making it nearly impossible for outsiders to understand what was being done. The recipes were passed down through carefully selected apprentices, ensuring that the knowledge remained within a small, trusted circle. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the way poison torture could be used to destroy not just individuals, but entire families or communities. A poison master could contaminate a water supply or food source, creating widespread illness that could be blamed on natural causes. Entire bloodlines could be eliminated over the course of months or years, their deaths appearing to be nothing more than a run of bad luck or divine displeasure. The psychological sophistication of these methods reveals a dark understanding of human nature that challenges our assumptions about medieval society. These weren't crude barbarians inflicting random violence. These were calculated, methodical practitioners of psychological warfare who understood that the mind could be a more effective target than the body. The legacy of medieval poison torture extends far beyond the Middle Ages. The techniques developed in those hidden chambers would influence interrogation methods for centuries to come, and the basic principle that chemical substances could be used to break down mental resistance would find new applications in every subsequent era. But in those medieval chambers, lit by flickering candles and filled with the acrid smell of alchemical experiments, the poison masters worked with a patience and precision that was terrifying in its implications. They understood that true power lay not in the ability to kill quickly, but in the ability to control completely. And in their carefully measured doses and precisely timed administrations, they created a form of torture that was as invisible as it was effective, as deniable as it was devastating. The architecture of madness, when sleep became the enemy. If the poison masters understood chemistry, the practitioners of psychological torture understood something even more fundamental: the human need for rest, for the daily renewal that sleep provides, and how the systematic denial of that basic necessity could unravel a mind more completely than any physical pain. Sleep deprivation as a form of torture required no special equipment, no exotic substances, no elaborate devices. It required only time, patience, and a thorough understanding of how the human mind deteriorates when deprived of its most basic requirement for psychological stability. In the hands of skilled interrogators, sleeplessness became a weapon more precise than any blade, more devastating than any rack. The process began subtly, almost kindly. You might find yourself in a cell that was actually quite comfortable by medieval standards. Clean straw on the floor, perhaps even a blanket. Your captors might even express concern for your well-being, ensuring you had adequate food and water. But there was something wrong with the cell, something that wouldn't become apparent until you tried to rest. Maybe it was the constant dripping of water from somewhere you couldn't locate, a steady rhythm that seemed designed to interrupt the moment you began to drift off. Perhaps it was the way the guards seemed to walk past your cell at irregular intervals, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls just loudly enough to jolt you back to consciousness. Or it might have been the positioning of the cell itself, located near the castle's kitchen or forge, where the sounds of daily activity continued well into the night and began again before dawn. The genius of sleep deprivation torture lay in its gradual escalation. The first night, you might manage a few hours of fitful rest despite the disturbances. You'd wake tired but functional, still capable of maintaining your mental defenses during questioning. Your captors would seem understanding, even sympathetic to your obvious fatigue. They might offer you better accommodations if you could just help them with a few simple questions. But the second night would be worse. The disturbances would come more frequently, more precisely timed to interrupt the deepest phases of sleep. You'd find yourself jolting awake just as you reached the edge of true rest, your body crying out for the restoration it was being denied. By morning, your thoughts would be slightly fuzzy, your reactions a bit slower. Still manageable, but the cracks were beginning to show. By the third or fourth night, the effects would become more pronounced. Your captors had learned your sleep patterns, studying when you naturally tried to rest and timing their interruptions accordingly. Guards would slam doors, drop heavy objects, or engage in loud conversations just outside your cell. The timing was never quite regular enough for you to adapt, never quite predictable enough for you to prepare. The psychological impact of prolonged sleep deprivation was well understood by medieval interrogators, even if they lacked our modern scientific terminology for it. They knew that a person deprived of sleep for several days would begin to experience hallucinations, paranoia, and a gradual breakdown of the barriers between reality and imagination. They understood that sleep-deprived prisoners would become increasingly suggestible, more likely to agree with whatever their captors proposed simply to make the ordeal end. What made this form of torture particularly insidious was how it turned the prisoner's own body against them. Unlike external pain, which could be endured through willpower and determination, sleep deprivation created an internal enemy that couldn't be fought or resisted. The body's need for sleep was as fundamental as its need for air or water, and denying it created a form of suffering that was both physical and psychological. The interrogation sessions during sleep deprivation torture were carefully timed to take advantage of the prisoner's deteriorating mental state. Questions would be asked when the victim was at their most vulnerable, when their ability to think clearly and maintain consistent answers was at its lowest. Contradictions in their statements would be pointed out, creating additional psychological pressure as they struggled to remember what they had said before. Medieval practitioners of this technique understood that different people responded differently to sleep deprivation. Some became agitated and aggressive, lashing out at their captors in ways that could be used to justify harsher treatment. Others became withdrawn and depressed, sinking into a state of hopeless compliance. Still others experienced vivid hallucinations that could be exploited by skilled interrogators who claimed to see the same visions or hear the same voices. The physical environment of sleep deprivation torture was often carefully designed to maximize its effectiveness. Cells might be positioned to catch the first light of dawn, ensuring that natural sleep cycles were disrupted. The temperature might be kept just uncomfortable enough to prevent deep rest without being obviously cruel. The bedding might be arranged to be almost, but not quite adequate, creating a constant low-level discomfort that made sleep elusive. Some of the most sophisticated sleep deprivation techniques involved the use of light and darkness. Prisoners might be kept in cells where torches burned constantly, eliminating the natural cues that regulate sleep cycles. Alternatively, they might be kept in complete darkness for days at a time, then suddenly exposed to bright light just as they began to adapt, The constant manipulation of their environment created a sense of temporal disorientation that added to their psychological distress. The guards who implemented sleep deprivation torture were often specially trained for the task. They learned to recognize the signs of approaching sleep and to time their interruptions for maximum effect. They understood how to vary their methods to prevent adaptation, how to create just enough hope for rest to make its denial more psychologically devastating. One particularly cruel variation involved allowing the prisoner brief periods of sleep, just enough to begin the restoration process, before interrupting it again. This created a cycle of hope and disappointment that was psychologically more damaging than complete sleep deprivation. The prisoner would experience moments of relief, thinking their ordeal was ending, only to have sleep snatched away again just as it began to provide comfort. The interrogators who specialized in sleep deprivation torture often worked in teams, ensuring that the pressure remained constant even as individual guards changed shifts. They would maintain detailed records of the prisoners' responses, noting which techniques were most effective and adjusting their methods accordingly. This systematic approach transformed sleep deprivation from a crude form of abuse into a precise psychological instrument. The long-term effects of sleep deprivation torture could last far beyond the immediate interrogation period. Prisoners who survived the experience often suffered from chronic insomnia, nightmares, and anxiety disorders that persisted for years. Their ability to trust their own perceptions had been so thoroughly undermined that they struggled to distinguish between reality and the hallucinations they had experienced during their ordeal. What made sleep deprivation particularly valuable to medieval authorities was its complete deniability. A prisoner who complained of being kept awake could be dismissed as making excuses or seeking sympathy. There were no visible wounds, no obvious signs of abuse. The prisoner simply appeared tired, perhaps a bit confused, certainly not at their best during questioning. Any observer would see nothing more than the natural effects of stress and confinement. The psychological sophistication of sleep deprivation torture reveals a dark understanding of human vulnerability that challenges our assumptions about medieval knowledge. These interrogators understood that the mind had its own weaknesses, its own breaking points, and that these could be exploited more effectively than any physical torture. They recognized that a person's sense of reality, their ability to think clearly and maintain their psychological defenses, could be systematically dismantled through the simple denial of rest. In the flickering candlelight of medieval interrogation chambers, as prisoners struggled to keep their eyes open and their thoughts coherent, a form of torture was being perfected that would influence interrogation techniques for centuries to come. The understanding that sleep was not just a luxury, but a fundamental requirement for mental stability, and that its denial could break even the strongest will, represented a sophisticated grasp of human psychology that was both impressive and terrifying in its implications. The guards would continue their rounds, the torches would continue to burn, and somewhere in the depths of the castle, another prisoner would discover that the simple act of closing one's eyes could become impossible when those in power decided that rest was a privilege to be earned rather than a right to be assumed. The living tomb, when walls became eternal prisons. Among the most psychologically devastating punishments in the medieval arsenal was one that combined the finality of execution with the prolonged suffering of imprisonment. Immurement, or live entombment, represented the ultimate expression of medieval society's ability to make inconvenient people disappear while ensuring they suffered every moment of their disappearance. Unlike the oubliette, which at least offered the possibility of eventual release, Immurement was designed to be permanent from the moment the last stone was set in place. The victim would be sealed alive into a specially constructed chamber, usually within the walls of a castle or monastery, where they would remain until death claimed them. But the true horror of immurement lay not in its finality, but in the deliberate way it was designed to prolong the dying process. The construction of an immurement chamber required careful planning and considerable expense, which tells us something important about how it was used. This wasn't a punishment for common criminals or minor offences. This was reserved for people whose continued existence posed such a significant threat that their captors were willing to invest substantial resources in ensuring their slow, hidden death. The chamber itself was typically just large enough for the victim to stand or sit, but not large enough to lie down comfortably. The walls were built thick enough to muffle any sounds from within, ensuring that the victim's cries for help would never reach potential rescuers. A small opening might be left for air and the minimal food and water needed to prolong life, but these openings were carefully positioned to prevent any possibility of escape or communication with the outside world. The psychological impact of immurement began long before the final stone was put in place. The victim would be forced to watch as their tomb was constructed around them, stone by stone, knowing that each addition brought them closer to a fate worse than death. They would see the opening that would provide their heir growing smaller, the space that would contain their final days taking shape around them. The builders worked methodically, professionally, as if they were constructing any other part of the castle's architecture. What made immurement particularly cruel was the way it perverted the basic human need for hope. In most forms of punishment, even the most severe, there remained some possibility of reprieve, some chance that circumstances might change, but immurement offered no such comfort. The victim knew with absolute certainty that they would die in that chamber, that their bones would remain there long after their flesh had rotted away, that they would never again see sunlight or feel fresh air on their skin. The provision of minimal sustenance was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the entire process. The small amounts of bread and water lowered through the air opening weren't acts of mercy. They were calculated cruelties designed to extend suffering. The victim would be kept alive just long enough to fully comprehend their situation, to experience the complete hopelessness of their circumstances, to understand that they had been deliberately forgotten by the world above. Medieval records, when they exist at all, suggest that immurement was often used for political prisoners whose knowledge made them too dangerous to release, but whose execution might create martyrs or provoke retaliation. Religious dissidents, court officials who had learned inconvenient secrets, or nobles who had backed the wrong side in succession disputes might find themselves facing this ultimate punishment. Their disappearance could be explained as voluntary retreat from the world, or simply not explained at all. The psychological deterioration of immurement victims followed a predictable pattern that medieval authorities seemed to understand quite well. The initial period would be marked by desperate attempts to escape, frantic clawing at the walls, screaming for help that would never come. This phase might last for days or weeks, depending on the individual's psychological resilience. The second phase typically involved a period of bargaining and pleading. The victim would call out through the air opening, offering information, promising cooperation, begging for mercy. They might confess to crimes they hadn't committed, or reveal secrets they had sworn to protect, hoping against hope that their captors might show clemency. But the silence from above would remain absolute, broken only by the occasional delivery of meagre rations. The The final phase was often marked by a kind of psychological collapse, a retreat into madness that provided the only escape available. Some victims would create elaborate fantasy worlds in their minds, imagining themselves in different places, different circumstances. Others would develop complex relationships with imaginary companions, carrying on conversations with people who existed only in their deteriorating minds. The construction techniques used for immurement chambers reveal a sophisticated understanding of both engineering and psychology. The walls were built to be absolutely secure, with no possibility of the victim breaking through even after years of effort. But they were also designed to allow just enough air circulation to prevent quick death from suffocation. The goal was to create a space that would preserve life just long enough for the victim to experience the full psychological impact of their situation. Some immurement chambers included additional refinements that demonstrated the medieval mind's capacity for calculated cruelty. False walls might be constructed that appeared thin enough to break through, encouraging the victim to waste their strength in futile escape attempts. Echoing chambers might be built to amplify the victim's own voice, creating the illusion of company while actually emphasizing their isolation. The timing of food and water delivery was often used as an additional form of psychological torture. Rations might be provided at irregular intervals, creating false hope that more substantial help might be coming. Sometimes food would be withheld for days, bringing the victim to the edge of starvation, before being resumed just as death seemed imminent. This cycle of hope and despair could be repeated indefinitely, each iteration breaking down the victim's psychological defenses a little more. The location of immurement chambers within castle or monastery walls was carefully chosen to maximize their psychological impact while maintaining absolute secrecy. They might be positioned near areas where the victim could hear the sounds of normal life continuing above them, the voices of people who had no idea of the suffering taking place just feet away. Alternatively, they might be placed in the deepest, most isolated parts of the structure, where the silence was so complete that the victim might begin to doubt whether the outside world still existed at all. The records that do survive suggest that immurement was sometimes used as a form of judicial murder that could be disguised as natural death. A victim who had been sealed in their chamber for months or years might eventually succumb to illness, starvation, or madness, and their death could be attributed to natural causes if their body was ever discovered. The chamber could be opened, the remains removed, and the space filled in as if it had never existed. What makes immurement particularly disturbing from a modern perspective is the level of premeditation it required. This wasn't a punishment carried out in the heat of anger or the immediate aftermath of a crime. It required planning, resources, and the cooperation of multiple people who understood exactly what they were creating. The masons who built the chambers, the guards who delivered the minimal rations, the officials who ordered the punishment, all were complicit in a form of murder that was designed to be as psychologically devastating as possible. The psychological sophistication of immurement reveals a dark understanding of human nature that challenges our assumptions about medieval society. The practitioners of this punishment understood that death itself was not the ultimate horror. The ultimate horror was the complete loss of hope, the absolute certainty that suffering would continue until natural death provided the only possible release. In the hidden chambers within medieval walls, where the only light came from the small opening that provided air, where the only sounds were the victim's own breathing and heartbeat, a form of punishment was being carried out that represented the absolute pinnacle of calculated cruelty. The stones that sealed these chambers didn't just imprison bodies, They entombed souls, creating a form of living death that was more terrible than any execution. And perhaps most chilling of all, these chambers still exist in some medieval structures, their stones still bearing the scratches made by fingernails, their walls still echoing with the memory of voices that called out for mercy that never came. They stand as monuments to the medieval understanding that true power lay not in the ability to kill quickly, but in the ability to make death itself into a prolonged and psychologically devastating experience. The Inquisitor's Theatre, where truth was manufactured in darkness. While the punishments we've explored so far relied on physical confinement and chemical manipulation, perhaps the most sophisticated form of secret medieval torture took place in chambers that looked deceptively ordinary. These were the interrogation rooms of the Inquisition and other ecclesiastical courts, where the art of psychological manipulation reached levels of refinement that wouldn't be out of place in a modern psychological thriller. The genius of these secret interrogation techniques lay not in their brutality, but in their subtlety. Unlike the dramatic torture devices that filled public imagination, the most effective tools in these chambers were often nothing more than carefully arranged furniture, strategically placed lighting, and interrogators who understood human psychology with a precision that was both impressive and terrifying. Picture yourself being led into what appears to be a simple room. Perhaps it's in a monastery or in the private chambers of a bishop's residence. The space seems almost comfortable, certainly more pleasant than the cell you've been kept in. There's a table, some chairs, maybe even a crucifix on the wall and some religious texts arranged nearby. Your interrogators are well-dressed, educated men who speak softly and seem genuinely interested in helping you resolve whatever misunderstanding has brought you here. But everything in this room has been carefully designed to create a specific psychological effect. The chair you're offered is slightly lower than those of your interrogators, subtly reinforcing their authority. The lighting comes from candles or oil lamps positioned to cast shadows in ways that make it difficult for you to read your interrogators' expressions while ensuring they can see every detail of your face. The religious symbols aren't there for comfort. They're there to remind you that you're not just facing human authority, but divine judgment. The interrogation itself begins with what seems like casual conversation. Your interrogators express concern for your well-being, ask about your family, your work, your daily life. They seem sympathetic, understanding, even friendly. This isn't what you expected from an Inquisition tribunal. Perhaps there's been a mistake. Perhaps this will all be resolved quickly, and you'll be allowed to return home. But as the conversation continues, you begin to notice subtle patterns. Your interrogators seem to know things about you that they shouldn't know. They mention conversations you've had with friends, places you've been, people you've spoken with. How could they possibly know these details? The realization slowly dawns that you've been watched, that your life has been under scrutiny for far longer than you realized. This was one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of Inquisition interrogation, the revelation that the accused person's entire life had been investigated in secret. Friends had been questioned, servants had been interviewed, neighbors had been encouraged to report suspicious behavior. By the time you found yourself in that comfortable room, your interrogators already knew more about your daily life than you might remember yourself. The questions begin innocuously enough. Can you recite the Lord's Prayer? Do you attend Mass regularly? Have you ever had doubts about church teachings? These seem like reasonable questions, the kind any faithful Christian should be able to answer easily. But each answer is carefully noted, and you begin to realize that there are subtle traps hidden in even the most basic inquiries. If you answer too quickly, You might be accused of having rehearsed responses, suggesting premeditation in your heretical beliefs. If you answer too slowly, you might be accused of hesitation, suggesting uncertainty about fundamental Christian doctrines. If your answers are too detailed, you might be accused of trying to hide something behind elaborate explanations. If they're too brief, you might be accused of being evasive or uncooperative. The interrogators work in carefully coordinated teams, each playing a specific role in the psychological drama being enacted. One might be sympathetic and understanding, expressing regret that you've been brought here and suggesting that a simple clarification will resolve everything. Another might be stern and suspicious, pointing out inconsistencies in your answers and suggesting that your case is more serious than initially thought. A third might remain silent, taking notes, his presence a constant reminder that everything you say is being recorded for future use. The manipulation of time was another crucial element in these secret interrogations. Sessions might last for hours without any indication of how much time had passed. There were no windows in these chambers, no way to judge whether it was day or night outside. The interrogators would take breaks, leaving you alone to contemplate your situation, but you would have no idea how long these breaks lasted. Time seemed to stretch and compress in ways that made it impossible to maintain a clear sense of reality. The use of religious authority was particularly effective in these interrogations. Your interrogators weren't just representing human law, they were representing God's will on earth. To resist them wasn't just defying human authority, it was defying divine command. They could quote scripture to support their questions, invoke the authority of saints and church fathers, and present their interrogation as a form of spiritual guidance designed to save your soul. The documentation process was itself a form of psychological pressure. Every word you spoke was carefully recorded by scribes who worked in shifts to ensure that nothing was missed. You would see them writing constantly, their pens scratching across parchment, creating a permanent record of everything you said. The knowledge that your words were being preserved for posterity, that they might be read by judges and officials you would never meet, added another layer of pressure to an already stressful situation. The interrogators were masters of the leading question, the subtle suggestion, the implied threat. They might mention that other people in similar situations had found it beneficial to be completely honest about their beliefs. They might reference the fates of previous heretics, not as direct threats, but as examples of what happened to those who chose the wrong path. They might suggest that cooperation now could prevent more serious consequences later, without ever explicitly stating what those consequences might be. The physical environment of these interrogation chambers was designed to reinforce the psychological pressure. The rooms were often located deep within religious buildings, surrounded by thick walls that muffled sound and created a sense of isolation from the outside world. The temperature might be kept uncomfortably warm or cold, creating physical discomfort that made it harder to think clearly. The seating arrangements ensured that you were always in a position of disadvantage, looking up at your interrogators, unable to move freely or comfortably. One of the most insidious aspects of these interrogations was the way they turned the accused person's own faith against them. If you were a sincere believer, the suggestion that you might be harboring heretical thoughts was genuinely distressing. The interrogators could exploit this distress, suggesting that your obvious discomfort proved that you were indeed guilty of the charges against you. Your own emotional responses became evidence of your guilt. The interrogators also understood the power of suggestion and false memory. Through careful questioning, they could lead you to remember conversations you never had, beliefs you never held, actions you never took. The human mind, under stress and pressure, is remarkably susceptible to suggestion, and skilled interrogators could implant false memories that felt completely real to the person experiencing them. The use of informants and false witnesses was another crucial element in these secret proceedings. You might be confronted with testimony from people claiming to have witnessed your heretical behavior, people whose identities were kept secret for their own protection. You had no way to confront these accusers, no way to challenge their testimony, no way to know whether they even existed or were simply fabrications designed to increase pressure on you. The psychological sophistication of these interrogation techniques reveals a level of understanding about human nature that was remarkable for its time. The interrogators understood that people could be broken more effectively through psychological pressure than through physical pain. They recognized that the human need for social acceptance, religious certainty, and personal dignity could be exploited more efficiently than the body's capacity to endure suffering. In those comfortable rooms, with their carefully arranged furniture and strategically placed lighting, with their soft-spoken interrogators and their meticulous record-keeping, a form of psychological torture was being perfected that would influence interrogation techniques for centuries to come. The understanding that truth could be manufactured through careful manipulation of environment, authority, and human psychology represented a dark milestone in the development of systematic oppression. The candles would continue to burn, the scribes would continue to write, and somewhere in the depths of religious buildings across medieval Europe, people would continue to discover that the most effective prisons weren't made of stone and iron, but of carefully crafted words and skillfully manipulated emotions. The Inquisitor's theatre was always in session, and the only script being followed was one designed to transform doubt into certainty, resistance into compliance, and individual conscience into institutional conformity. The silent treatment, when isolation became a weapon. While we've explored punishments that relied on physical confinement, chemical manipulation, and psychological pressure, perhaps the most underestimated weapon in the medieval torturer's arsenal was something far simpler and far more devastating: the systematic removal of all human contact and sensory stimulation. This was isolation refined to an art form, where the absence of experience became more torturous than any presence of pain. The practitioners of sensory deprivation understood something fundamental about human nature that modern psychology has only recently begun to fully appreciate. We are social creatures whose sense of self depends heavily on interaction with our environment and with other people. Remove those interactions completely, and the human mind begins to turn in on itself in ways that can be more destructive than any physical torture. The chambers designed for complete sensory deprivation were marvels of medieval engineering, though their purpose was anything but marvellous. These weren't the crude dungeons of popular imagination, but carefully constructed spaces designed to eliminate as much sensory input as possible. The walls were built thick enough to block all sound from the outside world. The surfaces were smooth, offering no texture for the hands to explore. The temperature was kept constant, eliminating even the basic sensory information that comes from feeling warm or cold. Imagine finding yourself in such a space. The darkness is absolute, so complete that you can't see your own hand in front of your face. The silence is equally total, broken only by the sound of your own breathing and heartbeat, which seem unnaturally loud in the absence of any other noise. There's nothing to touch except smooth stone walls, nothing to smell except the stale air, nothing to taste except the metallic flavour of your own saliva. At first you might think this is preferable to more obviously painful forms of torture. There's no rack stretching your limbs, No fire burning your flesh, no poison coursing through your veins. You're simply alone in a quiet, dark room. How bad could it be? But as hours turn into days, the absence of stimulation begins to create its own form of suffering. Your mind, desperate for input, begins to manufacture its own experiences. You start to see lights that aren't there, hear voices that don't exist, feel sensations on your skin that have no physical cause. The boundary between what's real and what's imagined begins to blur, and you find yourself questioning not just your perceptions, but your sanity. The medieval practitioners of sensory deprivation understood that different people would respond differently to this treatment, and they developed techniques to maximize its effectiveness for each individual. Some prisoners would become agitated and desperate, pacing frantically around their cells, calling out for human contact. Others would become withdrawn and depressed, sinking into a state of hopeless passivity. Still others would experience vivid hallucinations that could be exploited by interrogators who claimed to share their visions. The timing of sensory deprivation was crucial to its effectiveness. Prisoners might be kept in complete isolation for days or weeks, then suddenly brought into a brightly lit room for questioning. The shock of sudden sensory input after prolonged deprivation could be overwhelming, leaving them disoriented and vulnerable to suggestion. Alternatively, they might be given brief periods of normal sensory experience, just enough to remind them of what they were missing, before being returned to their silent, dark cells. The psychological effects of prolonged sensory deprivation were well documented by medieval observers, though they lacked our modern understanding of the neurological processes involved. They noted that prisoners subjected to this treatment often became confused about time, unable to distinguish between minutes and hours, between days and weeks. They observed that victims frequently developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe depression and anxiety. The manipulation of basic human needs was another crucial element in sensory deprivation torture. Food and water would be provided at irregular intervals, eliminating even the basic rhythm that meals might provide to mark the passage of time. The prisoner would never know when the next meal might come, creating a constant state of uncertainty that added to their psychological distress. The complete absence of human contact was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of this treatment. Humans are fundamentally social creatures, and the total elimination of social interaction creates a form of suffering that goes beyond physical pain. Prisoners would find themselves desperately craving even negative human contact, willing to confess to anything just to hear another human voice, to see another human face. Some of the most sophisticated sensory deprivation chambers included features designed to maximize psychological impact while maintaining the appearance of humane treatment. The cells might be large enough to prevent claims of cruel confinement, but empty enough to provide no stimulation. They might include basic amenities like a bed and chamber pot, but positioned in ways that offered no comfort or distraction. The interrogators who specialized in sensory deprivation torture understood that the technique required patience and careful observation. They would monitor their prisoners for signs of psychological breakdown, adjusting the treatment to maintain maximum pressure without causing complete mental collapse. The goal wasn't to drive the prisoner insane, but to bring them to the edge of madness where they would be most susceptible to suggestion and most likely to cooperate. The record-keeping for sensory deprivation torture was often more detailed than for other forms of punishment, as the effects were subtle and required careful monitoring. Guards would note changes in the prisoner's behavior, their responses to the minimal human contact involved in food delivery, their apparent mental state during brief interrogation sessions. This information would be used to refine the technique and determine when the prisoner was ready for more intensive questioning. The long-term effects of sensory deprivation could be more devastating than those of physical torture. Prisoners who survived the experience often suffered from chronic anxiety, depression, and difficulty with social interaction. Their ability to process sensory information had been so thoroughly disrupted that they struggled to readjust to normal life even after their release. What made sensory deprivation particularly valuable to medieval authorities was its complete invisibility. A prisoner who emerged from weeks of sensory deprivation showed no obvious signs of abuse. They might appear confused or distressed, but there were no wounds, no broken bones, no visible evidence of mistreatment. Any claims they made about their treatment could be dismissed as the ravings of someone who had clearly suffered some form of mental breakdown. The psychological sophistication of sensory deprivation torture reveals a deep understanding of human vulnerability that challenges our assumptions about medieval knowledge. The practitioners of this technique understood that the human mind required stimulation to function properly, and that the systematic removal of that stimulation could be more effective than any physical pain in breaking down psychological defenses. The chambers where this torture took place were often located in the most secure parts of castles or monasteries, places where the complete silence required for the technique could be maintained. The walls were built to exacting specifications, ensuring that no sound could penetrate from outside and no sound could escape from within. The doors were designed to open and close silently, preventing even the brief sensory stimulation that might come from hearing the mechanism operate. The guards who worked in these facilities were specially trained to minimize their interaction with prisoners. Food and water were delivered without conversation, without eye contact, without any acknowledgement of the prisoner's humanity. The goal was to create the impression that the prisoner had been completely forgotten by the world, that they existed in a space outside of normal human experience. In those silent chambers, where darkness was absolute and human contact was eliminated, where time lost all meaning and reality became negotiable, a form of torture was being perfected that attacked the very foundations of human consciousness. The understanding that isolation could be more devastating than violence, that silence could be more cruel than screaming, represented a sophisticated grasp of human psychology that was both remarkable and terrifying. The darkness would continue, the silence would persist, and somewhere in the depths of medieval fortifications, prisoners would continue to discover that the human mind, deprived of the basic inputs it needed to function, could become its own worst enemy. In the absence of external stimulation, the imagination would run wild, creating horrors more vivid than any torturer could devise, fears more paralyzing than any physical threat, and perhaps most disturbing of all, when these prisoners were finally brought back into the light, when human voices finally reached their ears again, they would often find that they could no longer trust their own perceptions. The line between reality and hallucination had been so thoroughly blurred that they would spend the rest of their lives questioning what was real and what was merely the product of a mind pushed beyond its limits in those silent, dark chambers where sensory deprivation had been transformed into the ultimate weapon against human consciousness. The invisible scars, how secret punishments shaped medieval society. The punishments we've explored tonight weren't just individual tragedies confined to hidden chambers and forgotten dungeons. They were part of a larger system of control that shaped medieval society in ways that extended far beyond their immediate victims. The knowledge that these secret punishments existed, even if the details remained hidden, created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that influenced how people thought, spoke, and behaved throughout the medieval world. The genius of secret punishment lay not just in its effectiveness against individual victims, but in its power to control entire populations through the mere possibility of its use. People knew that others had disappeared, that questions had gone unanswered, that certain topics were best left unexplored. They didn't need to know the specific details of what happened in those hidden chambers to understand that crossing certain lines could lead to consequences far worse than public execution. This created what we might call a culture of self-censorship, where people learned to monitor their own thoughts and words not just in public but in private as well. The knowledge that informants might be anywhere, that casual conversations could be reported and misinterpreted, that even family members might be pressured to reveal suspicious behavior, meant that the boundaries of acceptable thought and expression became increasingly narrow. The psychological impact of living under such a system was profound and lasting. People learned to compartmentalize their thoughts, to maintain careful distinctions between what they truly believed and what they were willing to express. They developed elaborate mental strategies for avoiding dangerous topics, for deflecting suspicious questions, for maintaining the appearance of orthodoxy while preserving some small space for private doubt or dissent. The families of those who disappeared into the secret punishment system faced their own form of psychological torture. They were left with questions that could never be answered, hopes that could never be confirmed or denied. Was their loved one still alive somewhere in a hidden chamber? Had they died quickly or slowly? Had they maintained their principles or broken under pressure? The uncertainty was often more devastating than definitive knowledge of death would have been. The practitioners of these secret punishments understood that their effectiveness extended far beyond the immediate victims. They knew that every disappearance sent a message to the community, that every unexplained absence created a space of fear and uncertainty that could be exploited to maintain control. The secret punishment system was as much about communication as it was about punishment, sending signals that were all the more powerful for being unspoken. The psychological sophistication of this system reveals a level of understanding about human nature and social control that was remarkable for its time. Medieval authorities understood that visible punishment could create martyrs and inspire resistance, but invisible punishment created only questions and fear. They recognized that the human imagination, when left to fill in the blanks about what might happen to those who disappeared, would often create scenarios more terrifying than any reality. The long-term effects of the secret punishment system extended well beyond the medieval period. The techniques developed in those hidden chambers would influence methods of control and interrogation for centuries to come. The understanding that psychological pressure could be more effective than physical force, that isolation could break spirits more thoroughly than torture, that the manipulation of environment and expectation could reshape human behavior, all became part of a dark legacy that would resurface in various forms throughout history. The documentation that survives from this period, fragmentary and often coded as it is, reveals a systematic approach to the study of human psychology under extreme stress. Medieval practitioners of secret punishment were, in their own way, conducting experiments in human behavior, testing the limits of psychological endurance, exploring the boundaries between sanity and madness. Their findings, though never published in any formal sense, were passed down through networks of practitioners who refined and developed these techniques over generations. The social impact of secret punishment extended to the very structure of medieval society. The knowledge that certain forms of dissent could lead to complete disappearance encouraged the development of elaborate systems of social conformity. People learned to read subtle signals, to understand unspoken rules, to navigate complex hierarchies of power and influence. The result was a society that was, in many ways, more tightly controlled than any system based purely on visible force could have achieved. The religious implications of secret punishment were particularly complex. Many of these techniques were developed and implemented by religious authorities who claimed to be acting in the service of spiritual salvation. The idea that psychological torture could be justified as a means of saving souls created a framework for cruelty that was both systematic and self-righteous. The practitioners could convince themselves that they were performing acts of mercy, helping their victims achieve spiritual clarity through suffering. The economic aspects of secret punishment also reveal important insights into medieval society. These techniques required significant resources, specialized knowledge, and dedicated facilities. The fact that medieval authorities were willing to invest so heavily in systems of hidden control tells us something important about their priorities and their understanding of power. They recognized that maintaining control over thoughts and beliefs was worth considerable expense and effort. The gender dynamics of secret punishment were particularly complex. While men might face political or religious charges that led to these hidden tortures, women were often targeted for different reasons, accused of witchcraft, heresy, or simply of being too independent or outspoken. The secret nature of these punishments made it easier to target women without the public scrutiny that might have accompanied more visible forms of persecution. The technological innovations developed for secret punishment had implications that extended far beyond their original purpose. The architectural techniques used to create soundproof chambers, the chemical knowledge required for subtle poisoning, the psychological insights needed for effective interrogation, all represented advances in human knowledge that would find applications in other areas of medieval life. The training required to implement these secret punishment systems created a class of specialists who possessed dangerous knowledge and considerable power. These individuals, whether they were poison masters, interrogation experts, or architects of hidden chambers, formed networks that transcended traditional social boundaries. They shared techniques, refined methods, and passed on their knowledge to carefully selected successors. The moral implications of secret punishment created lasting tensions within medieval society. The gap between public ideals of justice and mercy and the private reality of systematic psychological torture created a form of cognitive dissonance that affected everyone who was aware of the system's existence. People learned to live with contradictions, to accept that the world contained levels of cruelty that were never acknowledged or discussed. The legacy of medieval secret punishment can be seen in the development of later systems of control and oppression. The techniques pioneered in those hidden chambers would be refined and adapted by subsequent generations of authorities who understood the power of invisible force. The basic principles, that fear of the unknown is more powerful than fear of the known, that psychological pressure can be more effective than physical force, that isolation can break spirits more thoroughly than violence, would resurface again and again throughout history. The survivors of secret punishment, those few who lived to tell their stories, often found that their experiences had changed them in fundamental ways. They had seen the dark side of human nature, experienced the systematic application of cruelty disguised as justice, and learned that the world contained depths of evil that most people never imagined. Their testimony, when it was recorded at all, provides us with glimpses into a system of control that was both more sophisticated and more terrifying than the public punishments that filled medieval chronicles. The psychological insights gained from the study of secret punishment victims contributed to a growing understanding of human nature that would influence philosophy, theology, and early psychology for centuries to come. The recognition that the human mind could be systematically broken down and rebuilt, that personality could be altered through careful manipulation of environment and experience, that individual identity was more fragile than previously believed, all emerged from the dark laboratories of medieval secret punishment. In the end, the system of secret punishment that flourished in medieval Europe represents one of the most sophisticated and systematic approaches to psychological control in human history. It combined architectural innovation, chemical knowledge, psychological insight, and social manipulation into a comprehensive system for maintaining power through fear. The fact that it remained largely hidden from historical view for so long is itself a testament to its effectiveness and to the lasting impact it had on those who experienced it. The chambers may be empty now, the poison masters long dead, the interrogators silent, but the legacy of their work continues to influence our understanding of human nature and the potential for both cruelty and resistance that lies within us all. In studying these dark chapters of our past, we gain not just historical knowledge, but insight into the ongoing struggle between power and freedom, between control and conscience, that continues to shape our world today, closing the hidden doors. And so we reach the end of our journey into the shadows of medieval justice, having explored chambers that were never meant to be seen, techniques that were never meant to be recorded, and punishments that were designed to leave no trace except in the shattered minds of their victims. Tonight, we've walked through the oubliettes where people were dropped into darkness and forgotten, where the very architecture became an instrument of despair. We've examined the poison masters' workshops, where chemistry and cruelty combined to create suffering that could be disguised as natural misfortune. We've sat in the interrogation chambers where psychological manipulation was refined to an art form, where truth was manufactured through careful pressure and skillful deception. We've experienced the horror of immurement, where living people were sealed into walls to die slowly and alone. We've felt the crushing weight of sleep deprivation, where the simple act of closing one's eyes became impossible and sanity itself became negotiable. We've endured the absolute silence of sensory deprivation chambers, where the absence of experience became more torturous than any presence of pain. These weren't the dramatic public spectacles that filled medieval town squares, with their crowds and their theatre and their clear moral messages. These were the quiet horrors that took place behind closed doors, in spaces that officially didn't exist, carried out by people who were never there, against victims who simply disappeared from the historical record. What makes these punishments particularly unsettling isn't just their cruelty, but their sophistication. The medieval practitioners of secret torture understood human psychology with a precision that challenges our assumptions about their era. They knew that the mind could be broken more thoroughly than the body, that fear of the unknown was more powerful than fear of the known, that isolation could destroy the human spirit more completely than any physical pain. They understood that true power lay not in the ability to inflict visible suffering, but in the capacity to make people disappear entirely, to erase them from existence while keeping them alive just long enough to experience the full horror of their situation. They recognized that the most effective control came not from public displays of force, but from the quiet knowledge that certain lines should never be crossed, certain questions should never be asked. The legacy of these secret punishments extends far beyond the medieval period. The techniques developed in those hidden chambers would influence methods of control and interrogation for centuries to come. The basic insights that psychological pressure could be more effective than physical force, that environment could be manipulated to break down mental defenses, that isolation could be weaponized against the human need for connection, would resurface again and again throughout history. But perhaps the most important lesson from our exploration tonight is the reminder that human cruelty, when it's systematic and deliberate, can reach depths that are almost incomprehensible. The people who designed these punishments, who built these chambers, who refined these techniques, weren't monsters from some distant alien world. They were human beings, products of their time and culture, who convinced themselves that their actions were justified by higher purposes. They believed they were serving justice, protecting society, saving souls, maintaining order. They developed elaborate justifications for their cruelty, complex theological and philosophical frameworks that allowed them to sleep peacefully after spending their days perfecting methods of psychological torture. They were, in their own minds, the heroes of their stories, the guardians of civilization against the forces of chaos and heresy. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of our journey tonight, the recognition that the capacity for such systematic cruelty exists within ordinary human beings when they're given the right circumstances, the right justifications, the right institutional support. The medieval practitioners of secret punishment weren't uniquely evil. They were uniquely positioned to act on impulses that exist in some form within us all. As you settle back into your comfortable surroundings tonight, as you prepare for sleep in your safe, warm bed, take a moment to appreciate the simple freedoms that we often take for granted. The freedom to speak your mind without fear of disappearing into a hidden chamber. The freedom to question authority without worrying about poison in your food. The freedom to sleep peacefully without guards interrupting your rest. The freedom to exist in the light, acknowledged and accounted for, rather than vanishing into the darkness of official denial. These freedoms weren't won easily, and they're not maintained without effort. They exist because people throughout history have been willing to resist the impulse towards secret control, to demand transparency and accountability, to insist that justice should be visible and that punishment should be proportionate and humane. The chambers we've explored tonight still exist in some medieval structures, their stones still bearing the marks of fingernails, their walls still echoing with the memory of voices that called out for mercy that never came. They stand as monuments to human cruelty, but also as reminders of human resilience. Because despite everything that was done in those hidden spaces, despite all the sophisticated techniques for breaking the human spirit, people continued to resist, to hope, to maintain some core of dignity even in the face of systematic dehumanization. The trapdoors have been sealed, the poison recipes have been lost, the interrogation manuals have crumbled to dust. But the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion, for both oppression and resistance, remains as relevant today as it was in those dark medieval chambers. The techniques may change, the technology may advance, but the fundamental struggle between power and conscience, between control and freedom, continues in every generation. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the voices that once called out from those hidden chambers, the people who disappeared into the darkness of official secrecy, the victims whose suffering was designed to leave no trace. Remember them not just as historical curiosities, but as reminders of what can happen when power operates without oversight, when justice becomes secret, when human beings are reduced to problems to be solved rather than souls to be respected. And perhaps most importantly, Remember that the best defense against such systematic cruelty isn't just laws or institutions, but the simple human commitment to see each other as worthy of dignity, to question authority when it operates in darkness, and to insist that justice, if it's to be justice at all, must be visible to all. The medieval world may seem distant and alien to us now, but the human nature that created those secret chambers of suffering is the same human nature that exists today. The choice between cruelty and compassion, between secrecy and transparency, between power and justice, is one that every generation must make anew. Tonight, we've chosen to remember. Tomorrow, we must choose how to live with that memory. And so, the hidden doors of medieval punishment are closed once more. What we find in those shadows is a chilling reminder of what power, unchecked, is capable of. But it's also a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure even the most unimaginable fates. If you found this journey into the darkness fascinating, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories from the shadows of history, and let me know in the comments, which of these punishments shocked you the most? Sleep well and sweet dreams.